I was like, hello, and then not even on the dang stream. What's up? I just want to make sure that you can hear me because I'm using a new thing. Jada told me to try out StreamYard, so as you can see, the little logo. Today we are powered by StreamYard. It's a free account, so they got to put their logos all over everything. But if I like it, maybe I'll add it to the list of expenses. We'll see. If you can hear me, please send me a thumbs up just so I can make sure. I can also see how long the delay is because I don't know. Okay, you can hear me. Good stuff. Hey, Samaje. Good to see you. This is so fun. I'm going to see if a few more people pull up, but in the meantime, Samaje says they're waiting to pick up the kindergartners. Samaje, what do you do? What is your new job currently? I'm very curious. This is day 2. I mean, I guess technically day 3 of going live against my will. No, just kidding. Entirely within my will and control, going live and trying to get over my anxieties around doing this sort of thing, being seen, being heard. It is a little bit uncomfortable, but it does make me feel more engaged or inspired to pay attention to the things that I want to talk about on a daily basis and just get on and talk about them. So that's what I'm doing. I do have a topic for today because I just came across a tweet that I normally would have quoted and had personal commentary around that. I was like, oh, well, let me just talk about this on live and see what comes up. So back to the chat. Oh, you're an after school teacher and you make games and stuff. That's cute. I bet the children appreciate that, having something to do after school, especially like something fun and entertaining while you're waiting for your parents. I actually, whenever I was young, probably through most of middle school, but probably also in elementary school a little bit as well. I used to ride the bus. And then when I wasn't riding the bus, I was just like hanging out at school, especially middle school before I could drive. And I would just be with either the other neighborhood kids or with my cousin. Hey, Olivia. Good to see you. I would just hang out and get into trouble and cause problems. So it's nice when there's actual after school programs. Because, yeah, before I was in athletics, there was nothing to do but nonsense. So good to have somebody that cares for the children. Welcome in, Olivia. What I wanted to talk about today was this tweet that I came across where somebody was let me just read the tweet. If I would have thought about it, I could put it up on the screen, but I can't do that. So I'm going to just pull it up and read it to y'all. And it said, does therapy just flat out not work on people who have an IQ above 115? All the methods seem incredibly stupid and boil down to just gaslight yourself until you're convinced that nothing is actually wrong. Yep, exactly, Olivia. That therapy is pointless for high IQ folks. Now, there's so much to unpack in that statement, that's wrong. One of the things being the point about IQ points, since the whole IQ thing is racist and eugenicist in its nature, but that's not what I'm here to talk about. The issue that I personally take with that tweet is, or with this, let me start over. The issue that I generally take with certain critiques against therapy is not that therapy in what's it called? Psychotherapy in general. Um, the issue that I take with critiques against the system are not like, or I guess the critiques that I take against psychotherapy in general are not so much against the systemic critiques, because if we want to get into it, and we can get into it, there are loads of systemic issues with therapy, with mental health services, and with anything else that you try to do within a capitalist system where people need to make enough money to survive, and insurance is involved in the medical health industry in general in the US. Like, there are loads and loads and loads of problems with the system itself. And so I do acknowledge that and hold space for that, actually. I think it's really important to recognize, hey, Priya, good to see you. I think it's really important to recognize and to actually talk about the fact that therapy and mental health counseling, and even like, what's the other one? Uh, Social services and things like that, are all very corrupt and also rooted in a lot of eugenics and white supremacy. Like, a lot of the history of especially clinical psychology, where you're diagnosing people with mental disorders and, institutionalizing people, especially, like, there's a really long, rough history of all of those services that's honestly really unethical, especially in its origins. And we've gotten better about a lot of stuff today, but a lot of those issues still exist, in the sense that a lot of people can't access therapeutic services. A lot of people can't um, afford to maintain a relationship with a therapist. And then don't get me started on education and training to become a therapist or psychologist or psychiatrist. Loads of issues with actual education and the material itself being taught, and the origins and the roots of that. Um, there are so many issues with insurance, and there are so many issues with what insurance is willing to cover, and the steps that that an actual practicing therapist would have to go through to accept therapy in their, or to accept insurance in their practice, and all the requirements that come with that. Like, there are loads of systemic issues with psychotherapy as a whole, and with psychology, the field of psychology as a whole. And I am actually very curious, for the people who are here live and in the chat. Like, I'm curious what you think therapy is for, or what you go to therapy for, why you would want to see a therapist, and what you would expect to get from seeing a therapist. Because I think having like a baseline understanding of what people expect from therapy would help guide people in the right direction, instead of just straight up saying that therapy sucks and doesn't work for everybody, or all of these other things. Hey, frankincense and chill. I feel like that's Netta, but I'm not sure. I can't totally see, but it's good to see you. Welcome in. Uh, we are talking about therapy and what it's it for, and some critiques that people have of it. Why do people go to it? What do people expect from it? What does therapy actually do? Obviously, I'm biased. I can give a little background while people are responding in the chat. I went to school for psychology. I have an undergraduate degree in psychology with a minor in sociology, and I got that back in 2016. December 2016, I graduated a semester early with honors, cum laude. And I actually didn't intend to study psychology when I started school. I originally kind of wanted to go in pre-med, but I wasn't sure what I wanted to do when I went to school. I ended up choosing psychology because I've been in some form of therapy, whether that was with a psychiatrist who did prescribe me medication, or with a counselor or psychotherapist who could help me with some of the issues that I was having because when I was really, really young, probably around 6 or 7 years old, I was diagnosed with general anxiety disorder, GAD. And that can be, hereditary in the sense like that my dad struggles with it, and then my grandma, my dad's mom, my paternal family struggles with a lot of anxiety. And so I, from a young age, just was like, okay, this is a condition that I have. Um, there are ways that we deal with it are a lot of coping strategies and skills that I needed to learn. And then I was also eventually prescribed medication. I want to say at first it was a low dose of Zoloft, and then once I was in high school, I was off of it for a while, and then I got back on my senior year, second semester of my senior year, and got on back on Zoloft, and I stayed on it for about 5 years. So I had a lot of experience working with therapists. Oh, Katie. Hey, good to see you. Sorry. I couldn't see the image, so I wasn't really sure, but I'm so glad that you're here. Good to see you, Katie. Awkward. But yeah, I have been in and out of therapy my whole life, basically, to make a long story short. And I had seen a lot of different therapists over the years as well. And most of the time, I was seeing a white man or a white woman because that was just the town that I grew up in and the town that I went to school in as well, mostly white practitioners. And I was also really young, so I didn't have a whole lot of choice in therapists because it was through my parents' insurance. So, but I always thought the field was really interesting, and I always thought it was super helpful to speak to somebody about a lot of the issues that I was having because I didn't really feel like I could talk to my parents at the time or didn't know how to talk to my parents at the time about a lot of the stuff that I was feeling, especially when it came to anxiety. And they didn't know how to help me as well. So their option was to, find help for me, which I think was, you know, a reasonable idea. So, long story short, fast forward, like I graduate high school, I go into college, and I went to a liberal arts school, so I took a intro to psychology course in my first year, my first semester. And I loved my professor. I thought the content was really interesting. And as I was reading through the textbook, we got to the section that actually talked about the different disorders and medications and how medications work for different psychiatric disorders. And that's whenever I learned actually how Zoloft and SSRIs, which are called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, I learned how those work in the neuroscience or in the neurochemical sense, how they, bind to certain receptors in your brain and allow you to retain more serotonin so that you don't experience as much depression or mood swings or like different eating disorder things and stuff like that. And I thought that was really fascinating because no one had ever explained to me how the medication worked or what it was supposed to be doing. It was just, oh, you're experiencing anxiety and depression. Here, take this pill. So, um, just that little bit of being able to connect with the source material, I was like, oh, well, I should just major in this because I'm no stranger to therapy. I'd love to know how psychology as a field works and just went for it. And now we're here. And there's a lot that I learned that I thought was really fascinating. Um, but naturally, the courses that really radicalized me were the sociology courses because I learned more about capitalism and long histories of racism and why we have a lot of the social beliefs and um, why we have a lot of the social beliefs and what's it called norms that we have. And then it just really felt like, yeah, you can't have psychology without sociology and vice versa. It's very much like knowing how things work from the top down perspective, as in like from your mind to your body, and then also these collective perspectives of how other people and social situations influence our minds and our brains and our mental health. So Yeah, so that's my background and why I even give a shit about therapy and psychoanalysis in the first place. And that's also how I eventually would arrive at being what I call an astrotherapist, right? Um, so even though I'm not a licensed therapist, and I want to make that very clear, I'm not a licensed professional clinical therapist or anything like that, but I know enough to have an opinion on this particular topic. So I want to go to the chat real quick and see what some of these replies were. I asked the question, what is therapy for you? Why would you seek out a therapist? What do you want to get out of therapy? And Olivia says, I used to go for my therapist to solve my problems. Now I'd go to have someone interrupt my unproductive thought patterns. CBT has only helped so much, but I also want someone to hold space for me and see me. And CBT, for those who don't know, is cognitive behavioral therapy. And I can talk about that a little bit later. But yeah, I love the honesty and the transparency there of um, that you used to go for your therapist to solve your problems. I think a lot of people do have an expectation that if they go to some kind of an expert or professional, that person will be able to just solve all of their problems, solve all of their issues for them. Um, and so going now to have someone interrupt your unproductive thought patterns or to just hold space for you or help see you, yeah, I think that's really cool. Thank you for sharing that, Olivia. Priya says, anytime I don't go, or anytime I go to therapy, I don't stick with it long enough because money. Like, I prioritize my psychiatry before counseling, which is not good, but psychiatry is what keeps me functional, and counseling feels like a luxury. Wow, yeah. Woo, well, that's real. There are therapy is expensive. We were talking about barriers to access really early on. Like therapy is expensive and psychiatry is really expensive, but psychiatry does at least give you something that helps you kind of make it through until your next therapy appointment at least. And when you can't see a counselor or a therapist to speak to, yeah, it can get expensive. And this point about it feeling like a luxury is so real and so unfortunate that we have to feel that way. In fact, today I had to reschedule with my own therapist who I was supposed to see tomorrow. And I have to a lot. And my physical therapist had to reschedule because it gets expensive. And it's sad that it has to feel like a luxury that only people in a certain tax bracket can afford, but that unfortunately is the reality within the system. So I hear you on that. It's not a luxury, but it's definitely treated like one. And Katie says, I started therapy in college. Grief brought me there. And then I was like, huh, this is a great sounding board to get out of my head and the narratives that were running in my head. Yeah, I love that. Oh, and then they also say, what I like about therapy and learned with going to school for social work is the meeting you where you are aspect. There was no expectation to be more or perform more than what I am in that moment. Both of those are really great. I love that, like grief bringing you there. I mean, I don't love the grief part because grief is really uncomfortable, but it really can feel like it does feel like a lot of people don't know how to handle grief or process their grief. And so having somebody that you can take that to who actually knows what to do and how to be present with you. Sorry, there's a gnat. Um, and to just hold space for your emotions as well as help you process and get out of your own head, like you said, or make you aware of the narratives that you're running, or showing that there's no expectation and that you don't need to perform and that you can be with a therapist and they meet you where you're at. All of these are wonderful jump off points for what I really wanted to talk about, which is this idea that I hear a lot where people, myself included, and a lot of people I'm close to have described therapy as like mind games or like the tweet that I referenced earlier said gaslighting you into thinking things are fine or tricking yourself into um, being okay when things are very much not okay. And I really empathize with this. First off, like I genuinely and have been there before myself of feeling like, what is the point of this? Like I'm showing up, I'm paying all of this money to just talk to someone, and it seems like a lot of times we're talking in circles, or that this person is just asking me questions and they're not really like giving me advice. They're not helping me solve anything. It's just, these endless, what felt like pointless conversations. And I'll even say for me, as young as I was, I felt like a lot of my therapists, um, even into my early 20s, I felt like a lot of my therapists just like would sit with me while I'm like giving them the tea of the week, because I was usually going for relationship problems as like a queer kid who didn't really have anybody to talk to about queer relationships. And I felt like my therapist would be entertained with the fact that I would show up, just as myself, like giving the tea of the week and whatever drama I was in with whatever girl or whatever, situation I had going on. And I was solving a lot of my problems, or not even that I was solving a lot of my problems, but I was sharing things as if I already knew everything about my situation and what I was doing, and that I was like giving off this air of being really self-aware. And so I think a lot of my therapists just assumed that like, oh, like this person, seems to be pretty aware of themselves, like why do they need me? Maybe they just need somebody to think out loud and get stuff out to. And there was a point where I was like, well, if this is all that I'm doing, like I can do this by myself. I don't need a therapist for that. And today, with the knowledge that I have now, I would say that those were actually not very good therapists. They were probably either trained in a certain way that they weren't able to spot that I was doing a lot of really heavy masking, that I wasn't really being vulnerable, that I wasn't really being like totally emotionally honest sometimes. There were a lot of ways that they just never caught on to my bullshit. So I was never really aware of my own bullshit. And it did feel like it wasn't working for me, from that perspective. So it wasn't until the therapist that I have now, who is a Black woman, who I want to say is potentially pretty close to my age, if not a little bit older than me, maybe. Um, she was the first person to kind of call me out and say in a session a couple of years ago, like, you seem open. And I was like, over here thinking that I'm so vulnerable because I just freely share stuff all the time. But she was like, you seem open, but I don't know. It just seems like every time you come to session, like you want me to tell you that you're doing a good job, with therapy. Like you're a really good therapy student, especially knowing your background and your history. It seems like you just want me to tell you that you're doing a good job and you've got it all figured out. Those weren't her words verbatim, but that was how I interpreted the call out. And I was like, oh, um, why would you say that? Why would you say that to me? That's so uncomfortable. And I remember feeling like seen for the first time in a way that was actually uncomfortable. Like how I expected therapy to make me feel all of those years, that's how I felt whenever she said that to me. It was like I got real hot all of a sudden and real like I just felt red. I felt embarrassed. I felt like naked. Like, oh, that's so embarrassing that you would think that I'm just, coming to tell you about all of the things that I did right this week and wanting you to tell me I did a good job. But that was true. She read me. She read me to filth. And I was like, oh. And from that point, then we've been able to make way different progress. Um, Way different progress ever since then, that has been me actually talking about myself and centering my feelings. And that took years, first off. So there's that. The other thing that really changed things for me was seeing a somatic therapist. And I had no idea what somatic therapy was until I took a somatic experiencing course through my yoga teacher training, or through my yoga studio. And that's when I first learned about somatics in general. And then seeing a somatic therapist, I was like in the height of having just terrible anxiety in 2022 that was like unrelenting. And I couldn't stay in my body to save my life because I was just in constant anxiety spirals, like feeling anxious like I'd always dealt with my whole life, but stuck in a loop that was really bad for me. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep properly. It was really disruptive to my life. And so being with a somatic therapist taught me how to actually be with my anxiety and not run from it or not try to think myself out of it like, my previous psychiatrist had taught me. There were no mind games involved, right? It was just sit and feel through the intensity of this feeling because it will pass. And how can I self-soothe, or how can I stay with myself through that and not try to think it away or wish it away. And that was like revolutionary to me, genuinely changed my life. That, in addition to being on testosterone, like I haven't had anxiety like that since seeing that therapist. And when I do experience a wave of anxiety, I'm able to overcome it and move through it, without it lasting for hours and hours and hours, because it would genuinely, once it started, last for hours when I was younger. So all of that to say, um, therapy and this idea of like thinking yourself out of it, or thinking yourself, what do I want to say? Like this idea of like tricking yourself or playing these mind games on yourself or gaslighting yourself is not what therapy is doing. And I understand why people say that because, for example, if you are in crisis, like, for example, all of these people who just experienced Hurricane Helene and are literally, their homes have been demolished and washed away, and a lot of them are stranded without food. Like, therapy is not going to a therapist while you still have no home to return to is not going to solve the fact that you have no home to return to, and that we're still sending millions and billions of dollars to Israel to fight a war in the Middle East. Like, therapy isn't going to solve the problem of systemic racism that has placed your home in a place where you're subject to environmental racism. And whenever the chemical factory nearby is on fire and wafting toxic gas fumes all over your neighborhood that you are breathing in, like, therapy is not going to solve problems like that. And it's not that I think people think therapy is supposed to solve problems like that, but therapy is also not supposed to teach you to ignore your problems like that either. Now, my caveat is that there are some therapists who I think, depending on their modality, there are techniques that you can learn that help you to redirect your focus or redirect your attention, or to, like we said earlier, interrupt your thought patterns or your negative perceptions or stories or biases that we tend to hold on to. But there are many different types of therapy that do different things for different situations. And sometimes I think the most underrated quality, or I don't know, thing that therapy does is hold space for you to say your truth out loud and to speak to the issues that you're having and to be able to fully break down and just be witnessed as you're falling apart and not be corrected, you know, to just be held and seen and and have someone show empathy or even sympathy for what you're going through so that you can actually feel and see yourself in your experience. And I say that this is underrated because a lot of times, like, if we were never taught how to be with ourselves through an experience, and when I say be with ourselves, I mean like to actually feel the truth of what you're feeling right now, or to be able to say exactly how you feel without somebody telling you that you should or shouldn't feel a certain way, or to look at the bright side, or to be grateful because it could be so much worse. Like, so many of us experience that all the time because capitalism and all of these other systems just want us to put our heads down and to keep pushing even through all of the discomfort. Sometimes something therapy does that's so simple is give you language for the discomfort that you're experiencing, or give you language for the cycle or the pattern that you're stuck in and can't see your way out of. Like, the point is not to trick your brain or to trick you into feeling less bad. I think some people want that, to be honest. I think some people do go to therapy because they don't want to feel as bad, or because they want some kind of solution that will solve all of their problems and then they don't have to feel bad anymore. But the reality is, sometimes you need to feel bad. Like, sometimes you need to feel bad so that you can actually come to terms with how unfortunate a situation is that you're in and get out of it somehow. Like, that discomfort can be motivating. And I don't mean that, you know, I don't know. I feel like there's so many different ways that you could take that, and I'm not going to get bogged down in the ways that people can push back against that. But sometimes running from the bad feelings is what keeps you in bad situations. Now, something else in this theme that I wanted to talk about was that, like, what do I want to say? Something else that I want to talk about within that theme is like this idea that this idea of control, because I think control is a big piece of all of this too. And I'm going to get real Saturn about it, so y'all just buckle up, cuz you know how I am. Like, sometimes we want someone to either save us, or to tell us how to save ourselves, or to, I don't know, do the hard part for us. And sometimes we want to feel like we have more control over a situation than we realistically have as individuals, um, in our situation. So, we go back to systemic issues. There's not a lot that we as individuals can do to overcome systemic issues and systemic oppression. I think we're often told that if you work hard enough, then you won't have to deal with systemic oppression because you'll have so much money, you can just say fuck you and do whatever you want. And even that's not true, you know? Um, there's always, the way that things exist right now, there's always somebody more powerful than us who unfortunately has a lot more control over our circumstances than we do. And that's a shitty reality to come to terms with. It's a shitty reality to acknowledge because we want to believe that we can do something to avoid to avoid these systemic issues, but we're in it. It's in everything. It's in everything, right? So there's that. And I'm holding space for that. The other side of the spectrum is that there are people who really believe that they have control over everything if they, like law of attraction, think themselves into it, right? That is very much a thing, that there are people who think if you put your mind to it, you can do it. It doesn't matter. There's nothing in my way. The only thing stopping me is me. And I just need to lock in. I just need to lock in, and then all of my problems will go away. I just need to manifest. I need to vision board. I need to I need to light a candle. I need to, whatever it is, and all of my problems will be solved. And that's not true either. Sometimes we genuinely are powerless, and sometimes we genuinely have more power than we think that we do. So if both of these things can be true, and especially if both of these things can be true at the same time, how do we know which is which? And how do we know when to act and when to grieve? How do we know when to pivot and do something else because what we've been doing hasn't been working for us? And how do we get out of our own way in situations where it's actually applicable to get out of our own way because we're stuck in a negative thought pattern that is ruling our lives? That's what you go to therapy for, is to have someone help you see what your actual issue is and how much power, how much control you have in that situation. Especially with coaching, with a good coach, mind you, all of this is with the asterisks of having a capable, competent, and trauma informed and culturally educated therapist or coach, like actions can be taken in most situations at some point by you to actually change, if not change your material circumstances, then to change your perspective of the situation. And I say that because it's not about playing a mind game. It's not about lying to yourself. It's not about invalidating how you feel. It's about recognizing that our attention is actually really powerful and our focus is actually really powerful. And what I mean by that is, again, not in the law of attraction sense that if you think about something hard enough, it'll happen, but going back to psychology and the way that the brain works. I talk about this a lot in astrology with like Jupiter and the sun, right? So the way that our brain works is it has these frameworks or these networks where we form ideas and beliefs about the world around us and how things work. And a lot of that is created through pattern recognition and through experience, through actual life experiences. When we've seen something play out a specific way over and over and over and over again, the literal pathways in your brain that help you draw those conclusions get deeper and deeper and deeper. And the cool thing about the brain is that we have the ability to do that. We have the ability to study patterns and to anticipate certain outcomes. But we also have the ability to change, like to change our actual minds. It's called neuroplasticity. Um, because attention and focus is so strong, in most people, there are caveats, of course, with like different types of neurodivergence and certain actual disorders where things are just functioning differently. And one could actually argue that everybody's brain functions differently because all bodies are different. So keeping that in mind, as humans, like the genetic material that makes up our brains and the way that brains are designed to function, like we do have some element of control or at least awareness that we can gain over um, our thought patterns in the ways that we are making certain associations or telling certain stories, narratives to ourselves about what something is. And a lot of times, what we think something is, I was talking about this yesterday, I think a lot of times what we think something is in the concrete sense, like there are multiple perspectives and multiple different ways to interpret an experience based on the information available to you. And a lot of times we just don't have all of the information from our own individual limited perspective. We just don't have all of the information. We can't see everything. We can't know everything. And so the whole reason you would go to a therapist or a coach or a counselor or whoever to talk to a friend even or an elder is to get perspective, is to get another opinion or another set of eyes on your situation and to see something that you may not be seeing or that you may not be focusing on, because naturally in your mind's way of protecting you, you're going to focus on the bad thing. Like so much so that all you can focus on sometimes is the bad thing and this bad outcome that you don't want to come out. And sometimes we can get stuck in that. It can turn into obsessive compulsive disorders. It can turn into hyperfixations. It can turn into what are they called? Sometimes delusions in the schizophrenic sense or whatever. It can turn into something that is very much out of your control as an individual, and that's where you might need to see a psychiatrist or get on some kind of medication to give you some agency back, right? Sometimes that's needed, and sometimes it's needed temporarily for other people. But the whole point is that sometimes things are not exactly the way that we see them, and we need somebody else's perspective or somebody else to just kind of challenge us a little bit, not so that we can just take on whatever they see and immediately agree with whatever it is that they're seeing or that they say is the truth, but to challenge us to just think differently about our own situation and then come to our own conclusion aside from just this one way that we've always looked at something. And sometimes that's not always a big dramatic shift of like, oh, well, this thing that I thought was a problem is actually not a problem at all. Sometimes it just looks like having more nuance about a situation. Like, yeah, this really bad thing happened, and this person definitely caused a lot of that issue, but also all of these other things. There's freedom in that. There's liberation in that. There is flexibility in being able to see multiple perspectives of a singular issue or experience that you've had. And then there's also the factor, the value, the aspect of time, where when you're first in a situation or in the thick of a situation, the way that you view it while you're in it is not going to be the same as you view it weeks, months, years down the line, which is very Saturn, right? Like our perspective shifts, our narratives shift. We change as we change and grow and experience more things. Different situations can look differently. So therapy does a lot more than just help you talk about a problem ad infinitum and nothing ever happens. Sometimes you do need to talk about a thing a million times before you're ready to think about it differently or look at it differently or see what your other options are. But therapy can give you a lot of choice in your situation. It can give you a lot of comfort sometimes in your situation if there really is nothing you can do and nobody else in your life wants to hold space for that. Um, a good therapist would be able to hold up a mirror to you and help you better see yourself and how you are showing up in a situation so that you have the option to try and choose differently or to get whatever additional help or support or accommodation you might need. Um, I think it's worth it to argue that there are other ways to do exactly that. It doesn't necessarily always have to be through a therapist. And maybe those things don't need to be gate kept to a licensed therapist, hence why I do the work that I do and why I feel so passionate about creating. Um, I don't know if I would go so far to call them mental health practices, but they could be. They work that way for me using astrology because it's just another tool to help process and look at things and get different perspective on things. Um, there are other ways that other civilizations and cultures do this sort of thing with community care. And, I don't know references that I can mention right off the top of my head, but there are a number of different ways to tackle these issues, but they all involve other people because we need other people's perspective sometimes. And so, yeah, for people who may not have community that they can trust, they might need to see a therapist so they can learn how to trust people again, or so that they can understand more about the situation that led them to distrust everybody so much that now they feel like they can't trust themselves to decide who to trust in the first place. Um, so yeah, I understand why people are frustrated with especially psychotherapy as a field. And I think if you don't want to invest the time and the energy and money, or you can't invest the time and the energy and the money into it, then there are other ways to get what it is that you need. And I am in full support of that. I just don't like trashing um, psychotherapy and other forms of therapy as an entire field. And even CBT, like I have my own gripes with CBT. It's not something I usually recommend to people, but there are certain mental illnesses or disorders where CBT actually works. It's been around as long as it has because it works for some people and for some situations, just not everybody. And so that doesn't mean it should be dismissed as a practice altogether. It just means it's worth acknowledging the context that it was born in, and it's worth acknowledging the context that it's being practiced in and what it's being used for. Therapy and coaching, just like everything else, is not, it's not the right tool for the job all the time. And every therapist and every coach is definitely not the right therapist or coach to be in the field at all, let alone to be practicing with you directly. But that doesn't mean we need to throw the whole field out. It doesn't mean that every alternative that comes up to therapy is going to be more valuable than therapy itself. It just means that different tools for different jobs. So I hope that we as a society don't get this so far into the weeds on this issue that people devalue therapy and psychotherapy altogether. I think a lot of people just don't know what they don't know and maybe think that they're more self aware than they actually are. Just because you know how to talk about your problems and you know what the root of them is or what the origin story was, your villain origin story, or being able to articulate correctly or knowing, all of the layers of systemic issues and all of this other stuff, knowing the literature, knowing the theory, like just because you know all of those things, it doesn't necessarily mean that you couldn't benefit from therapy. And yeah, hella critiques on the field that are valid and that we should continue to critique because the more that we critique it, the better it should get. The more that we critique it, the more people. Oh, hello from from Finland. Your name is interesting. But yeah, there are plenty of options out there, and I think the goal is not even really to cape for therapy as much as to maybe change your perspective on therapy as something that allows you to become more curious about yourself and about the world around you and about approaching or seeing problems in a way different than what you're used to doing. You do have to have some willingness to open yourself up to being wrong sometimes or to trying something new, doing something difficult, especially when it doesn't feel good. Because what did we say about growth the other day? Growth is not comfortable, doesn't always feel good. But sometimes, you get stronger. So cool. That's all I have to say for today. It's almost been an hour. It'll never blow my mind how fast the time flies when I'm running my mouth. So thank you for joining today. Thank you for your input in the chat. Um, you know where to find me. My links are everywhere. This has been my daily live. I am Mixed Mercury, the Astro Himbo of Mixed Mercury Astrology. And I will see you all tomorrow for whatever I decide to talk about tomorrow. Oh, I see. I see your name. I was in a few toxic channels and changed my name. My bad. As I can, a few days. Okay, that's cool. Well, it's nice to meet you, Jerk Freebird. And thank you for being here, Olivia. Thank you for being here, Katie, and everyone else who joined, Priya, Samaje, and whoever watches this later. Thanks for tuning in. I will see y'all next time. Bye.